Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Marty, and I am with the Metals Service Center Institute. Welcome to today's safety webinar, free to all of our members. I want to explain a couple of points to you about how this works before we get started. This will just take a few minutes. There is a question and answer period that's going to follow the presentation today. So there will be roughly 45 minutes of presentation time, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A afterward. So in the GoToWebinar interface, you have the ability to enter questions as our presenter is going along in his presentation today. So I would encourage you to do that, because we will do our darndest to make sure that all of your questions get answered. So if you enter a question into that Q&A interface, I will manage that queue, and I'll make sure to ask Steve as we go along. All of you are on mute, and the reason you're on mute is so that we can minimize all the background noise. There are a number of you on this call today, well over 50, and it's climbing steadily. So we just want to make sure that everybody can hear. So you're going to be on mute, and please remember to enter questions thereby on the Q&A interface in the GoToWebinar box. Steve, can you advance to the next slide, please? One reminder real quick before we get started, MSCI does hold an annual safety conference. I'm not sure that everybody on the phone has been to that. We just finished one a few weeks ago in Indianapolis, Indiana, but we're going to have another one next year in 2018. It'll be the week of October 20th through the 26th, and it's going to be in Houston, Texas. So please at least put that down on your calendar for that week. We don't have exact dates yet, but we will again be co-locating with the National Safety Council, and that gives everybody an opportunity to take advantage of all of our collective content and safety in general from them, and specific safety issues in the metals industry from MSCI. So appreciate you putting that on your calendar. Thank you. And now let's get started. I want to introduce our presenter today, Steve Yates. Steve is the founder and president of Optimum Safety Management, and Optimum has been a member of MSCI for quite some time now, and has been helping us do a number of things, this kind of free webinar on safety for our members being one of the most prominent. Steve has a lot of experience in both manufacturing and operations and construction technology. He's a recognized leader in safety management systems, implementation of those. He has a lot of local, regional, and national customers, and he's also an authorized OSHA outreach trainer and a certified leadership coach. So Steve, we at MSCI thank you for all your help and for being a member, and I'm going to turn it over to you now to start your presentation.
I appreciate that, Chris. Thanks very much. And you know, we really appreciate our membership with MSCI. We're members of many different associations, but like none other, MSCI really supports a great mission of driving injuries down and trying to promote a positive safety message and building safety cultures across its members. So it really aligns with Optimum's vision of seeing workers everywhere valued and safe. And we're really appreciative of the partnership that we have with you, Chris, and the rest of the staff and the members here at MSCI. So always a pleasure to address the groups that come together for these webinars. And we're seeing some of the results of that as we interact with different companies and around the safety conference and those kind of things. So I just want to echo what Chris said about the safety conference there. We had a great conference this year down in Indianapolis, and typical for those conferences every year, you think of the 3 or 4 or 5 people that you don't see there who really should be. So we're really encouraging everybody to reach out to other companies, for those who are in a position where you're employing subcontractors or other vendors, or you have partners that are in the industry that have not been at that conference. We would really encourage you to reach out to them and ask them to engage safety at a new level and come join the rest of the industry at that conference this year in Houston. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and dive into our topic today. We're talking about OSHA compliance for the metals industry. We're going to talk about the top 10 most frequently cited for both service centers and mills, but I'll also be talking a little bit about metal fabrication, because many of the service centers are providing value-added services that go much beyond just the primary metal manufacturing for the mills, and the distribution of metal product for the service centers. We're actually getting into things like rolling and welding and cutting and drilling and punching. There's a lot of different forming and things like that that are happening. When we look at the metal service centers today, they're becoming very sophisticated members of the supply chain for the automotive industry and many other industries that require a little bit more sophistication, a little bit more safety when it comes to some of the hazards that we're seeing. So we're going to have a good discussion of each of the top 10. I've got a summary slide for each of the groupings here, and then the question for you as a participant in today's webinar is, how will you use this information? Because the reality is, when we look at, in particular, the service centers, the number of service centers that were inspected by OSHA last year, and we are talking here also, I should clarify, about federal OSHA. It would get very confusing if we tried to pull all of the state programs in as well. So the states may have a little bit different emphasis here and there, but we are talking about the federal OSHA, frequently most cited. When we look at this, very few service centers by percentage of the whole actually get inspected each year. So, you know, you could walk away from this call and think, well, that's everybody else. That's not going to be me. It's only a small percentage. The reality is, though, that the inspections that we see here are indicative of what optimum staff sees when it walks into service centers across the industry and mills across the industry. Even in aluminum and foundries and those types of things, we see a lot of these same issues that we're going to see through this presentation in each and every one of them. So the reason OSHA has an enforcement agency is because people violate the standards. The reason the standards are written is so that people don't get injured at work. And we're going to tie this together at the end of the presentation by talking about the BLS, or Bureau of Labor and Statistics, data for our industry, and how, as an industry, we are failing to drop our rates in line with industry trends across all of manufacturing. So I want to show you some data on that and hopefully incite you to take this information and utilize it to drive injuries down within your workplace. That's really the main goal here today. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. We'll take a look at the top 10 most frequently cited OSHA standards across metals. The number one in service centers, here we see, is the control of hazardous energy, or lockout tagout. Now that's likely not a surprise. However, I've left a little bit of the history here on this slide to talk about what I did last year, which was that this was a total shocker to me. Pardon the pun. That's about as funny as the jokes get through a presentation like this, right? But a real shocker here. We saw in 2015 what we would have expected, and that was that OSHA is frequently citing lockout tagout in service centers. A lot of equipment, slitters, saws, shears, brainers, different sorting equipment, that type of thing, and they find lockout violations with it. However, in 2016, this violation dropped to number 15 for service centers. It wasn't even in the top 10, which was really quite amazing. I didn't quite understand why. May have just been a blip in the graph, because here we are again in 2017, and this is the number one, again, for OSHA within service centers. It has been a steady number one for mills, as you can imagine. And I should remind everybody, too, that these are brand new statistics. We're looking at the top 10 from October of 2016 through September of 2017. So this data is brand new, just out, and really reflects the attitude of the agency when it comes to what their emphasis is and what they're looking at. Now, the other thing that we're going to talk about in each of these slides is what are the frequently cited issues. As we work with metal service centers and companies across all industries, we often talk about the low-hanging fruit. When OSHA comes in for an initial inspection, they might cite you for lockout tagout, as in you don't have a program or general training for your staff. When they come back for a follow-up inspection, and you have your general training and your program in place, you're going to get an attaboy for those 2 items. However, if the inspector's savvy, what they're going to start to do then is look beyond that and start to look at some more of the detail within the lockout standard, and there is plenty of it. So what I want to present to you here is you really need to be working through the developed procedures, making sure that you have what are called machine-specific de-energization procedures for each and every piece of equipment in your plant that has more than one energy source. So that could be something that has a hydraulic pump, it has pneumatic energy, it has electrical energy. As soon as you're over one of those energy sources, you need to make sure you have a procedure for how to de-energize and put that machine in a zero energy state for maintenance activities. OSHA often finds that those procedures are not in place. And then periodic inspections, you're required to annually inspect each of the authorized personnel, make sure that they understand the procedures on each of the machines that they're responsible to lock out. But you're also required to do an annual review of each of the procedures and make sure that nothing's changed. So make sure that you're looking through all of those different sections of the lockout standard and understanding what they are so that you can make sure you're complying with all of those. Specific enforcement of procedures is another item. Have you issued disciplinary action for employees who are violating the standards? If OSHA comes in on a amputation hazard inspection, there is an emphasis program out there for slitters, saws, and shears. Any company that has any of that equipment, OSHA can walk in, and that's enough of a reason for them to open an inspection. If they come in on that type of inspection, or what we're seeing a lot of right now is the new amputation record-keeping requirement, where you're required to call in any hospitalization of even one employee, as well as fatalities, but also now amputations and or loss of an eye. There's a new criteria that came out a couple of years ago. And what we're finding is that when people do call in for those particular types of injuries to report them to OSHA, OSHA will frequently trigger an inspection. If it relates to lockout, you're going to be subject to all of these lockout requirements. Now, one of the things that I want to make sure everybody that's on the line is aware of is that one of our quarterly webinars, we did a review of the lockout tagout standard. And I will tell you that it was painstaking for me to write that presentation because of all of the material that goes into that standard. But that was probably one of the best recaps of the lockout tagout standard that I've ever witnessed walking through that. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote it, but there's a lot of good information in it. And I want to encourage you to look for that either on the MSCI website or to let us know at the helpline you're looking for it. We can point you to our YouTube channel where that is posted, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of it. Really good if you're trying to evaluate your lockout program. So that's how we want to use this. We want to use this presentation to be thinking about where do I stand with my program in each of these areas. And you can do that as you go through the presentation. You'll have the handouts available. You can use this as a checklist as you go through it. All right, moving on to number 2, powered industrial trucks. Again, not a real surprise here. We saw that it was number 1 for service centers in 2016. It's been number 5 in the mills consistently. Frequently cited issues here relate to the training for the worker. Is it valid? Is it up to date within 3 years? Refresher training. Are they being trained post-incident? So if you have a forklift driver, operator, that is involved in an incident, they need to be retrained at least regarding what caused that incident. They don't necessarily need to go through the entire class again, but they do need to be retrained to understand how they could have prevented that incident, and that needs to be documented and put on file. This is one of the standards that OSHA requires a certificate of training be maintained. So they do frequently get companies for not maintaining that certificate. The forklift itself, and this is a big issue, especially with a lot of the smaller service centers. We see very old equipment. We see equipment that's not under a preventative maintenance program. We see equipment that has missing labels on controls or missing load plates, tires that are in bad condition, damage to the forks, maybe with a burnt hole in the fork for a compressor toe ball. Now, there's a lot of different things that are done with forklifts that are actually improper, so they need to be maintained in a safe operating condition. And then inspections. An examination for defects does need to be done each and every shift, and OSHA does not require that that's documented, but the reality is you cannot hold your operators accountable to doing that inspection, and you cannot prove that it's done if it's not documented. So we do recommend that you document those inspections and make sure that those are maintained on file. Okay, moving on to number 3. This is and again, it's something that we see. I would tell you that out of all of the top 10, I would not disagree with any one of these being very frequent issues that we see within a metal service center. So here we see this is up from number 4 in 2016. This may be a result of the amputation hazard inspections. Frequently cited issues here for machine guarding relate to the general sections of the standards, and you'll see listed across the top of the screen there are 5 different particular sections that OSHA cites within for machine guarding. If you were to look at the OSHA website for top 10, you might find a little bit different order than the way we rank them. What we tend to do is we wrap up anything that's related in the, like here in the machine guarding. So you might find 212 at the number 3 position, 213, 15, 17, 19, those will all be cited down below, and we'll pull all that up into number 3 to give you a good grouping here so that you can look at your machine guarding issues all at once. But do remember when you're looking at machine guarding that you're not only talking about physical issues like ingoing nip points, 2 rollers that rotate together that could cause an employee to get drawn into the machine. That would be more of a physical hazard. You also need to consider chemical hazards. So if you have a splash hazard, something that in a process that could splash on the employee, that needs to be guarded. And then one that's frequently lost or missed is the thermal hazards. So anything 140 degrees and higher needs to be guarded from personnel contact. So you might have frequently in foundries or mills a lot of hot parts. In some of the processing areas, you might have process piping that's heated or has steam or hot water running through it. And we have to make sure that that's guarded from people being able to contact it. Points of operation, where a shear acts on the metal and shears it, or a saw, we need to always make sure that we have the proper guarding there. We see that a lot with band saws, where there's an exposed section of the blade outside of the blade guides, or where the blade guides are being left too far open and exposing too much of the blade outside of the material that's being cut. So OSHA would require that you close those down to only the area being cut, and that there are retractable guards on either side of the blade to cover it. Power transmission, rotating shafts, couplings, gears, those types of things all need to be guarded. Always remember, proper machine guarding technique is to guard over, under, around, and through towards the front of the hazard. So we've got to be thinking about how an employee could reach underneath and up into that point of operation to unjam a guard, some sort of remove material that's jammed. Any way that they can get to that point of operation would be considered a violation. And then please take care of this one. Bench grinders. This is so easy to care for, and yet we see this in almost every shop we walk into, and OSHA cites it on almost every inspection, is bench grinders. So tongue guards, that's the piece on the top within 1/8 of an inch of the wheel. The tool rest within 1/4 of an inch of the wheel, making sure that your sides are guarded as well. There are diagrams for this all over the internet. Make sure that your bench grinders are set up properly and not going to create a problem for a tool being drug in. Very good. All right, moving on to number 4. No surprise within a service center that there are issues with overhead and gantry cranes. So we see this at number 4 this year. It's climbed up from number 8 last year. It's come up as well in the dropped a little bit in the mills, but still right around that number 10 mark in the mills. Frequently cited issues, safe operating condition. A lot of times we see pendants on the crane that don't have good pendant support cables, where the festoon cable is being stressed. That can stress all the controls inside of it. Hooks with no safety latches, those types of things. No examination for defect or inspection each shift, monthly and then annually. There are 3 different requirements for standard duty rating on cranes, and you need to make sure that all 3 are met, and they're met by different people. So the monthly is more of a maintenance inspection. Each shift is by operator. The annual is definitely by a third party that has certified mechanics or mechanics that are knowledgeable and capable to inspect crane issues. The other thing we see frequently cited are rigging issues. So cable that's not properly labeled, and many other issues. I think we cover that actually later in the presentation as a separate item. Number 5, hazard communication. This is down from number 3 last year. Again, I think this is a result of those amputation inspections pushing some of the more physical hazards up in the list. But while OSHA's in looking at those, they see something improperly labeled, they're going to go ahead and tag you for a HAZCOM violation. So remember, you need a written program, information and training on the chemicals, safety data sheets, and then labeling. And don't forget your incidental use containers, where you're pumping out of a 55-gallon drum into a small sprayer. That needs to be relabeled with the same chemical hazards. Here we go for number 6 in service centers now: wiring methods, equipment, safeguards, and practices. This is sections 303 through 305 and 333 through 335 of the 1910 standards. This all relates to electrical. So you can see in the photo here, there are open disconnects, there are open raceways, live conductors exposed. These are situations we find frequently when we walk into fabrication shops, metal service centers, mills, not so often in the mills, but definitely in the others. So what OSHA is looking at here is proper installation and use of equipment. We see frequently junction boxes terminated at the end of SJO cord or extension cord, and they're left on the floor used as extension cords. That's all improper. If the equipment's designed to be bolted to a wall, it has to be used that way. Grounding that's not permanent and effective. We see a lot of broken conduit that breaks your ground path for the ground prong, because you're running that through that electrometallic tubing, or EMT. And once that's broken, a coupling's broken because it's hit with a forklift or some other hazard, you lose your ground. We see a lot of flexible cords being used as permanent, and that's a no-no. You can't do that. Can't use an extension cord wire tied to a building in place of conduit. You need to actually install permanent conduit for those. Pull boxes and junction boxes with covers open. And then one that's very easily cited because there's so much to it is the safeguards and safe work practices found in NFPA 70E. This is a big deal. There's a lot of workers each year that are electrocuted and shocked because of poor safety practice when it comes to electrical wiring and working on equipment when they're not authorized or qualified. So good standard to follow, consensus standard that OSHA will cite against, is the NFPA 70E. Lots to be said on that. We could do 3 webinars on that item alone. So moving on to number 7, we do see the general duty clause, the general duty paragraph cited at number 7 here in service centers and number 11 in mills. Frequently issues like magnetic restarts on cutting machinery, making sure that when you re-energize the equipment, it can't automatically restart. You have to actually press a button to get it to start again. Codes that are outside of the OSHA regulations, such as ANSI codes, and so on. There are many consensus standards for bending and forming equipment and coil processing equipment that OSHA can draw into and cite under the 5A1 standard. So just be aware of those. If you have that type of equipment, you should be familiar with those standards. OSHA record keeping. We are finding now that this is up to number 8 in service centers, where it used to be number 11. It's climbed one notch in the mills, but still fairly infrequent down at 18. What that tells us is that the mills are typically a little bit more sophisticated and running a tighter program, bigger, heavier hazards. So they're a little bit more alert to some of these things. However, you'll see some of the frequently cited issues under record keeping. New, though, is the duty to report, section 39. So with OSHA's new amputation hazard reporting requirements, if you fail to report that and the fire department or the emergency room contacts OSHA and says they have an employee there that's there as a result of an amputation and tells them the name of the employer, OSHA will look into that. If you've not reported it, you will expect a citation. So make sure that you're accurately reporting to OSHA when you need to. Excuse me. Moving on here to number 9 for service centers, we find respiratory protection. This is a pretty in-depth standard and one that has a lot of different sections to it. Number 3 in the mills again this year. And what we're finding is that at the mills, this would include things like general PPE requirements, eye and face protection, hand, head, foot, electrical. These can all be cited within the service centers. We just don't see them within the top 10. When we look at respiratory, make sure that you're thinking about, as soon as you have an employee in a respirator, medical evaluation, written program, training, fit testing, and proper storage and selection. Each and every one of these are sections of the standard that can be cited. You do need to have a respiratory program administrator named on your staff who can watch over these things. This all applies for dust masks as soon as they are required. So if you have voluntary use of dust masks, you can drop some of these requirements, but the training needs to be done still, and making sure that you're watching over that program. Now within the mills, I've added this slide to make sure that we cover some of these other items that relate to PPE, because this is number 3 in the mills. So frequently cited issues here: certification of hazard assessment. So OSHA does require that you do a PPE hazard assessment. PPE is provided, used, maintained, sanitary, and reliable. And then appropriate eye and face protection. And then I mentioned the other equipment on the last slide. So OSHA has gone as far this last year as citing head, hand, foot, and electrical protective equipment within some of the mill environments. Not a tremendous amount of inspections there. It may have been one particular mill who had a lot of these issues and picked up citation for every one. So just a reminder to the rest of us, make sure that you are dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. OSHA loves to go down the list and issue more citations than they really should be allowed. Okay, open-sided floors. We're getting into now the walking and working surface standard. So we are seeing some issues here, not as many as I would have anticipated. With the release of that new standard in, I believe it was November of 2016, I would have thought that there would be more issues related to it because they've really expanded the standard. But we do see here, it's still in the top 10. So guardrails on platforms more than 4 feet or high, more than 4 feet in height. And then safety requirements for scaffolds and ladders. Remember that those are now very similar to the construction requirements, and they're very detailed. So if you have not become familiar with the new walking working surface standard, you need to make sure you check into that. I believe we do have a webinar on that issue as well that we put out when that first came out, and that was sometime last year. Take a look on the MSCI website. If you don't see it there, let us know. We'll get that into your hands. And then number 10 here in the mills, but they're being much more specific in the mills, citing things like fixed stairs, ladders, portable ladders, and so on. Occupational noise exposure. Now, we've all walked through a noisy service center or a coil processing facility and know that this is an issue. However, we're seeing that it's not even anywhere within the top 20 within the mills this year, or pardon me, within the service centers this year. It is, however, number 6 in the mills. It's, again, another very detailed standard and a lot of sections that OSHA can cite from within this. So we want to make sure, again, we're looking at all the sections and making sure that our program is tuned up. It would include monitoring and then audiometric testing for the individual employees at baseline and annual retesting, and there must be a training element in there. Make sure you're remembering your record-keeping requirements for decibel shifts. In the event that an employee has hearing loss, that's got to be recorded on your log. There's also notification requirements to the employees. Very, very important to know what the hearing level is within your facilities. Now, also make sure you're not just relying on the iPhone app you might have. Those are not calibrated, and you do need to be doing 8-hour time-weighted averages to know what the levels are. You can reach out to a firm like ours in the event that you need testing like that. There's many people across the country that do that. A lot of times your workman's compensation carrier will also do testing like that for you. Here we are at the number 7 for mills. Now I'm going to fill in the top 10 for mills now. So this does not show up in the service center list, but in the mills, lead is a frequently cited issue. Exposure monitoring, written plans, PPE, respiratory, changing rooms and showers, worker training, lots of different requirements. If you have lead exposure, you really need to make sure that this is taken care of, because as the graphic on the right illustrates, we take this exposure home with us and it gets into our wash cycles and so on, and actually can affect our children, creates sterility and a number of other issues. So we want to make sure that we do take care of this issue if you have lead exposure. This is one that kind of bounces up and down within the service centers. It's number 8 in the mills again this year. Has come up from 34 last year. So again, I don't know what's creating that wild swing. However, even within the service centers, there are permit required confined spaces. Most of the service centers that we start working with, when I ask them, do you have confined spaces? They say no. As we do the initial inspection, we find several, and some of them that are actually being entered, things like machine pits, underneath rolling equipment or coil slitting equipment. If you have coil slitters, I can tell you right now, you do have confined spaces, because your take-up and looping pits are all confined spaces. They are also permit required confined spaces. So you really do need to make sure you understand this exposure. It can create a real problem for an employee from a health standpoint, from a physical hazard standpoint, but also a lot of OSHA exposure. Many different sections here. They all have to be done and done well to mitigate this hazard. Slings. This was number 5 last year and has disappeared off of our top 10 list for service centers. Mills, it's climbed to number 14. Frequently cited issues, so damaged rigging, no labels or tags, no daily inspections, and no documented inspection of alloy steel chains, at least annually. So lots of issues. And I will tell you that the photo that you're seeing there on the right is a piece of rigging that we found back in 2007 on a construction site that was brand new. And when it was put into service, the first lift, the rigging literally came apart. The manufacturer, the rigging supplier who put it together, forgot to compress that swaged fitting to lock in that loop. And as the lift began, it literally slid down the rigging as soon as it got put under load. So you do need to test your rigging. You do need to watch it, inspect it, make sure it's good. That could have created some major problems when that load got in the air, and it was a heavy one. As you can tell, that's pretty significant wire rope. Here we are at means of egress. Now, I've included this because of its severity. It's number 13, though, in the service centers, dropped from number 10. It's number 19 in the mills, so it came up a little bit there. But exit routes and flammables near exits are extremely important to maintain. So let's make sure that we're watching over that issue within our facilities making sure those are clear, not blocked. We have a lot of facilities that are in not such good areas when it comes to crime rates and so on. And so we find people locking their exit doors. You do need to have a process where those are unlocked during the day when the building is occupied, and make sure that people can actually egress the building adequately. Frequent misconception is that overhead doors are adequate means of egress. That is inaccurate. So if you have an overhead door and no exit door next to it, you do not have an emergency exit in that area. You may not need one. However, you've got to look at that issue based on length of travel from work areas and so on, making sure that you don't need an exit door in that area. If you do, you might be cutting one in to the side of your building. So make sure you're aware of that issue. Don't get caught unaware. Portable fire extinguishers. Again, this didn't show up in our top 10 anywhere, but it is a frequently cited issue when it's not done well. It just drops down on the list, and it's very important from a life-saving standpoint, so I wanted to include it for you. They need to be provided and accessible. They need to be inspected monthly visually and annually. They need to be maintained. And then training. You do need to have a program in place, initial and annual training for these. So again, just make sure that that's taken care of for you. So there's your top 10 most frequently cited for OSHA. What we want to do now is we want to look at value-added services. And the way that I'm doing this is I've looked at the NAICS codes for fabricators. So boiler, tank, shipping container manufacturing, any other prefabricated metal product. And what we would suggest is you utilize the same top 10 list. It's very, very close. However, you need to add these couple of items. Number one, lead. So we saw that on the mills, but on the service center, you need to add lead and make sure that you don't have exposures there to lead by virtue of your process, depending on what type of metal you're fabricating. Spray finishing. A lot of fabricating shops will do structural steel, and they'll do red oxide primers. Some of them are using low VOC paints where they're water-based and so on. You really don't have the flammable and combustible hazards. You do have respiratory hazards, and you need to make sure those are adequately tested with an industrial hygienist, and make sure that you're using the proper respiratory protection. However, if you're using lacquer-based paints or anything epoxy, you typically have a flammable or combustible material, and you do have some issues here you need to make sure that they're taken care of. And that's where a lot of that, the prior two slides, the fire extinguishers and emergency exits. Also within the fab shops, we see a lot of oxygen and fuel gas welding and cutting. We see this within a lot of the service centers that are doing plate burning and tank manufacturing and so on. So oxy-fuel gas welding and cutting issues need to be looked at, and they are extensive. If you have that type of hazard, give us a call. We'd love to have a conversation with you about some of the typical hazards we see that can be very easily mitigated. Also, watch your welding fume exposures, so metal fume for carbon steel, hexavalent chromium for stainless steel. That is an OSHA number 7, top 10 for fabricators. So that comes up anytime you're welding on stainless steel. So you always need to make sure you're testing for that exposure. There are significant long-term health exposures to inhalation of hexavalent chromium. So got to make sure that we're covering that. Okay. I did tell you at the beginning of the webinar, I wanted to cover a little bit on the OSHA incidence rate trends. I pulled some information on the BLS.gov website recently, and what we see is that based on this news release late 2016, all private industry is trending downward. We see a nice trend from 5 on a total incident rate all the way down to 3 over a 12-year period. And we would like to say that the metal service centers and mills are trending in the same direction. However, I went ahead and put together these next two graphs for us to illustrate where we're at from an industry standpoint. And what we find is that our trending is not following private industry in general. Over the last 4 years, we're actually seeing a rise in our total incident rates within metal service centers. We're seeing pretty much the same rate between 12 and 15 here on our DART, or days away restricted and transferred rate, And then for our most severe rate, lost time incident rate, we're seeing that it's stayed the same. And a little bit of a drop in these rates in 14, but they've all come right back up again in 15. Now, the 2016 data is not yet available. It was released last year on October 27th, so we're expecting that release anytime here soon. But as soon as it does come out, I'll go ahead and update these graphs, and we'll try and get a communication out to everybody that's on the webinar as an update on these rates. Here in the mills, we're seeing that we had a nice little drop in 13, and that's been maintained, but it's maintained at the same level as the service centers. Now, we're not seeing a decrease in that rate beyond that. What this tells me is that we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit off the tree. We've taken care of, across the industry, a lot of the basics. And what we're not seeing, though, is that we're navigating a good vision forward on driving to zero. Now, what I'm doing here is tying in our last webinar, which was on safety leadership. And I want to remind everybody, we talked about John Maxwell's 21 Laws of Leadership, and we talked about the law of navigation being casting a vision and making it compelling. Industry average, just not good enough, right? At the point where we're at a 5.1 or 5.2, what that means is that out of every 100 employees, 5 of them are going home injured at the end of the year. So if you have 600 employees under your control within your facility or facilities, right, you have 30 employees that are going home injured that year. That shouldn't be acceptable. The fact that it's happening should drive some different thought. And what I just want to remind everybody of is John Maxwell's comment, his main tenet with leadership is that everything rises and falls on leadership. So if we are not driving good leadership in our service centers or in our mills around this topic of safety management and safety performance, we're going to get what we get. We're not going to be able to expect anything better than what we're getting currently, and the status quo is the best we can expect. So what I do want to do is I want to remind you of some free resources we have for the webinar attendees that were on the leadership webinar, but we'll extend them here today. John Maxwell's book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, is a great digest, one law at a time, that you can run your leadership teams through. And what we've done here at Optimum to empower our leadership teams within our clients and to empower our safety professionals here to teach is I've gone on camera and recorded about a 1.5 to 2 minute long leadership video that relates to safety back to the law that John teaches in that chapter. They are yours for the asking. We have a website where you can log in and take advantage of each and every one of these 21 law videos. You can use them, buy the book, give it to all of your folks. I'm not on John Maxwell's payroll, so I don't get a cut of his book sales. I'm just telling you, it's the best book I've found to be able to quickly instruct people on these different laws. And we get great comments from our clients on them. And I would just tell you that you can use them as well. That would be our gift to you. We'd love to see you put these to use. So anyway, send an email to the helpline. We'd love to get you the instructions back on how to access those. Chris, with that, I'm just going to end with saying we've got the webinar slide handouts. Don't forget, in the handouts area, we do have OSHA's top 10 most frequently cited quick reference cards in there for you that you can download and pin up and use. We did notice an issue on the service center one this morning. There's item 8 is missing on it, so we will be updating that. We'll send an update out on that item after the webinar, probably later on today, but you can feel free to download the ones that are there. Chris, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to you right at 10:45 here for Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So we do have quite a long series of questions, and I'm going to take them in the order that they came in, and try to refer you back to the section of your presentation that was being discussed at the time the question was asked. So in the case of the first one, you were talking about the control of hazardous energy. And the question came in about the number of problems or the number of areas that might need to be subject to a procedure or an annual inspection at a single location. That can be a very large number. In the case of this question, there can be over 100 at a single location. So the question is, do you have to review each procedure every year when you have that sizable number of possible hazards?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris, and it's one that frequently comes up. And this is one of those things, you know, when I got into this profession, I committed to myself that I would be the kind of person who's going to give the answer that people need to hear, not necessarily what they want to hear. Because I know that people would love to hear, nah, you don't really need to do that. The reality is the OSHA standard requires that every procedure that's written is reviewed and that review is certified annually. So what that means is that each of those could be looked at, made sure that there have not been any problems within that procedure over the last year, that there's no changes to the equipment, like, you know, maybe maintenance has gone and added a new or changed the disconnect, and now they've moved it to a different location and your procedure shows it, and that needs to be updated. So as long as nothing has changed with it and there's been no problems using that procedure over the last year, they would then put a revised date or a reviewed date on it that would show the new update, and you know, any changes would be made, or they would just say, nope, this is good, we've reviewed it, and that should be certified on the procedure each year. So unfortunately, yes, every year.
Okay. Next question, going back to the section on overhead and gantry cranes. This one's probably a little quicker answer. Is there an OSHA standard for wireless crane controls?
Okay, so to my knowledge, in the standard, I'm really searching my memory on that right now, trying to think if there's a particular section that addresses wireless crane controls, and I don't recall one. There would not be a separate section of the standard for what the person is referring to as a remote pendant operator.
Right.
There will be ANSI standards that relate to it. So ANSI B30, and then there's a number of sections in the B30 standard that relate to overhead and gantry cranes. I'm sure that ANSI would have something to say about them. There are items in the crane standard that do refer to pendants and pendant operators, but nothing specific that I'm aware of. I would refer you to the ANSI standard, though, ANSI B30, to search through that section of the standard and make sure that that you find it there.
Okay. Walking and working surfaces and related items. What type of guarding is required for a loading dock that's 48 inches high? Does it need to stop a forklift or just a pedestrian?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so at 48 inches or higher, we've got to provide fall protection. That fall protection would need to stop the person from going over it. As far as the forklift, you know, I would say that from a best practice standpoint, we do see service centers that are providing stop logs or those types of things. But I will tell you that is very, very infrequent. It would not be considered, to my knowledge anyway, a requirement at the edge of a dock. And typically a guardrail will, although it will not stop a forklift at a full run or at any run because of the power in them from going through it, it provides certainly a visual barrier and you know, as much of a barrier as we have in front of other hazards like you know, all of our pallet racking and those types of things. So I think no, there's not a necessary requirement for a forklift.
Okay. Can you talk about what's required or considered refresher training for powered industrial equipment? Is it repeating the initial training, or is it reviewing documented procedures, or just practical observation of competency? Can you elaborate on that a little bit, Steve?
Yeah, for refresher training, it would be the review of their competency to operate a forklift, making sure that they are still competent to operate. We typically we would recommend you do that each year, okay? And then, so Optimum's recommendation on this would be a competency review each year, retraining every 3 years, documented retraining. The OSHA minimum is going to relate to competency review, light refresher every 3 years. We just feel that that's probably not adequate. So understand the difference between the best practice recommendation and the OSHA requirement. A lot of environments, we really like to make sure that people are thinking this through from a standpoint of how often do my operators operate that forklift? So we have a number of environments where we see people, they might have 10 forklifts and they have 35 certified operators. And what that tells us is that those operators are going to infrequently operate the equipment. So if that's the case in your workplace, you would want to make sure that that refresher training is done more thoroughly and more frequently. We recommend typically annually then with refresher training. If you only have 10 forklifts and 15 operators and they're using them very frequently, then you can maybe utilize the 3-year requirement and go to the OSHA minimum. Hopefully that helps.
Okay.
A little bit of guidance there as well as just the answer to the question, right?
Okay. Well, as long as we're on forklifts, let's get this one in too. This question says that the facility has older forklifts and they don't have backup alarms on them. Should backup alarms be installed on those forklifts?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that frequently comes up. So the manufacturers don't all put backup alarms on their equipment. In fact, even new equipment can be sold with a backup alarm as an option. So the OSHA requirement is that if the equipment was sold with a backup alarm, the backup alarm needs to be maintained. If the employer added a backup alarm as an optional piece of equipment after the fact, the backup alarm needs to be maintained. Okay? Now, what the OSHA requirement is that the employee has a method for warning people in all directions of travel, so forward and backward. So what we do see on a lot of the new equipment is that as the employee sits in the seat and rotates backwards, there's a handhold at the back of the cage where they can grab a hold of to look out the back of the forklift. Now we're seeing buttons on those, like a push button right where the thumb would be, that allow the employee to control the horn and sound the horn while they're going in the reverse direction. If that equipment is not there, what then has to happen is the employee has to be hitting the horn while they're looking backwards and traveling backwards using the horn on the front of the equipment. So a little bit of a, if-then kind of an answer, but that's the long and short of the backup alarm and horn issue for warning.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a question about confined spaces. This is specifically a service center question. This person says they don't think they have any confined spaces, but they're not sure. So what types of confined spaces would you refer them to or typically see within a service center?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's talk about a smaller service center that's not doing value add other than maybe saw cutting to length, okay? It would be very possible that a service center like that would not have, would not have confined spaces other than if they have a triple catch basin in the building, or if they have a sewer cap in the building, that would be accessible to the employees, that type of thing. That would be about the only thing. Now, what you need to consider is, do you have a large compressed air system in the building with a large air receiver for a reservoir? If that tank has a manway for inspection where a person can actually climb into it and access the inside of that air receiver, that would now be considered a confined space. And that would need to be labeled and put on your inventory. So any confined space needs to be on an inventory and labeled. And then beyond that, if your service center now goes to coil slitting, I've already mentioned take-up loops, take-up pits. Those on a coil slitting line are definitely a confined space. When we get into, I'm trying to think of rolling equipment, a lot of those will have service pits underneath them that would be considered confined space. So anywhere that you have a large piece of processing equipment that's set into the ground on pillars and has areas around it, those are the types of things you have to look for. Another thing, Chris, heating and ventilating systems will often have makeup air units in them. Those makeup air units would have a large box that houses all of the fans and so on. If it has a door on the end of it, you can walk into it. It has equipment inside it that could rotate and hurt an employee. It's also not designed for continuous occupancy, has only one way in or out, limited means of entry or egress. Now that's a confined space. So, there are a number of different things that need to be considered, but you've got to know the definition of confined space, and you have to look for anything that has those criteria.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
You just mentioned the area of the next question, which is means of egress. In regard to alarm systems for egress, do you know what the requirement is? Or how to find out what it is?
Yeah, so we're talking about, I think, like fire alarm systems or what's required there. There are specific statements made in the OSHA standard about what's required and how to evaluate that. So I would refer people to that section of the standard for means of egress. In general, you need to have a way of warning the employees that are in the building in the event of a need to evacuate the building for fire, tornado, whatever the other issues are. Those alarms should be not independent, but they should be distinct, so that if you have, a fire, you want to get everybody out of the building. If you have a tornado, you want to get everybody to a shelter-in-place location. So that can be done through handheld air horns. It could be done through a siren in the building. There's many different ways of doing it, but the requirements are there in the OSHA standards.
Okay. Two more questions.
Sure.
Number one, if you have storage above an office, but it has no access from the ground, it's got no ladders, it's got no steps, do you still need to have railings in that area?
Yeah, it's a great question. We see this a lot. So you do need to also have the weight limit posted on that so that people don't put an engine block up there and then it falls in on the purchasing manager's desk. So make sure you have that also. Probably the most important thing.
There you go.
If the employees are going to stand on that platform to access the materials, they're exposed to a fall hazard, and then therefore, yes, you would need guardrail. Often we see people use removable sections of railing there. If everything is on pallets and you're just going to lift it up with a pallet, with a forklift and bring it down to access the materials, then the answer is no. So it relates to employee access.
Okay. Last question. Who should be responsible for daily forklift inspection if it's not the operator?
Yeah, we always recommend that it's the operator or an operator, and that every operator that's going to use it that day would check to make sure it's been done. So the first one that finds it undone would do it. We do see plants try to have maintenance do the daily inspections. I would just tell you that's setting them up for failure because they've got so many other things on their plate in most service centers. So typically we recommend the operator. The only other one would be maintenance, but like I say, probably not a good idea. And Chris, if I can just address one thing real quick. I mentioned that we had an issue with our top 10 card for service centers. While we've been answering questions, it actually came in by email with a revised version. I've now uploaded it into the handouts. So anybody that's still on the line, if you want to grab that handout, feel free to do it. It's the top 10 metal service centers is the one that's been revised.
Quick work.
Okay.
And that completes the list of questions too, actually. So we're pretty much only about a minute over time. Sounds
great. Well, this has been a great review. I think for me, it just gets my head going again and kind of back into this, the access of thinking about the standards and what I need to look at when I'm in a service center. It's just a great review. So I'd encourage you to post those top 10 cards around your workplace, get everybody thinking about them, give them to your safety committees or your safety leadership teams and have them working through those issues. Don't forget the annual safety conference, please. Coming up in October, put it on your calendars, make plans to be there. We'd welcome your input and your attendance there and love to see you there. As we close the webinar out, please be reminded if you have any other questions, we do have the safety helpline that's available to you, 9 to 4 p.m. Central, responses within 24 hours. You can also email those questions into us, and we would love to engage with you around any topic related to safety. So with that, Chris, I'm good here. Hopefully we've had a good webinar, and I appreciate the opportunity to continue to present these for you.
Yeah, thanks for doing it, Steve. It's always interesting, and we always get a nice big audience for these webinars. So I encourage everyone to be looking for our promotions for the next one. That'll be coming up within a couple of months. Thanks, everybody. That closes out today's webinar, and I hope you all have a great and a safe day. We're going to leave the webinar open for a little while here, so that if you haven't been able to download the handouts, you'll be able to. And we'll leave that open for at least 5 or 10 minutes or so. So please feel free to grab the handouts, and then I'll close the webinar at around 10 after 11 Central Time. So thanks again. Take care.